Thanks a lot. So I guess it's appropriate you mentioned Vince McMahon, because if anybody knows anything about pro wrestling, Vince would come out with the music, no chance in hell. That's what you got. And in a moment, yeah, I apologize in advance for the kind of lack of hope I'm going to be giving the room in a moment. But, okay, this rather messy looking diagram is what I have dubbed the Octopus. It is my attempt at gaining an understanding of how the regime operates. Here's a slightly less messy version. I believe that getting this right is of paramount importance, because a true understanding of the power structure is the first step towards bringing about what we like to call a circulation of elites. Now, this has several similarities with the model put forward by Curtis Yarvin, who has no doubt influenced my thinking, but it also differs in some very crucial respects. And I will tease out exactly how in a moment. And I will just say, this is not like an attack on Curtis. I'm doing it in the spirit of healthy debate, which, as the first talk, should go through the next couple of days. I don't expect everybody to agree with me at all. First, though, I will outline some core assumptions that went into producing this. Second, I will flesh out some general observations necessary to understand this model. And third, I will go through each of the 8 tentacles, which will be as boring as it sounds, of the octopus, and outline some of these important differences from Yarvin's model that I just mentioned. So, core assumptions. To begin with, let us remind ourselves of 7 key lessons from elite theory, as distilled in my best-selling book, The Populist Illusion, still available from all good book retailers, and I've noticed they're selling some at the back there, so I encourage you to pick it up. That joke has never failed, by the way, in all my years of even 10 years ago when I started lecturing. I always mention available on Amazon.com, and even like the sleepiest undergraduate, in his hangover would kind of laugh at that moment. So I'm glad it still kind of works. Anyway, I take these 7 ideas, these 7 lessons, as a given, okay? But just for a refresher. First, we have Mosca's law. This is that the organized 100 will always defeat the disorganized 1,000. This central principle of power is important to keep in mind at all times, because it demonstrates that the anarchic idea of bottom-up power is simply impossible. In addition, as dissidents, it tells us exactly what the name of the game needs to be: greater organization than your rivals. And you can start applying this in all sorts of strange ways, like, for example, 100 organized dissidents should outmaneuver 1,000 disorganized journalists. Second, who says organization says oligarchy? Now, this is, of course, taken from Robert Michel's. It's not only a distillation of Mosca's law, but also a reminder that power simply cannot operate without coordination. Third, there is no genuine separation of powers. Now, this is generally taken from Bertrand de Juvenel and Carl Schmitt, but it is also implicit in James Burnham's recognition of the managerial class. The logic of power is always towards absolutism. Powers can be theoretically separate, but if the people sitting in each of the respective offices are of the same stripe and of the same belief system, if they are political friends, in other words, it will not matter. See also the Supreme Court telling Texas and almost 20 other states that they have no standing, for example. And I mean, just as a This is something I've, in kind of cobwebs of my mind, I remember Thomas Sowell's old book, Knowledge and Decisions. Do you remember I used to talk about that? And basically the boomicons have the opposite assumption. If you remember what Sowell says, he says, it's the systems and the incentives that matter, not the people. I think Trump has shown, if he's shown one thing, it matters who those people are at every level. You know, they need to be friends, not enemies. In other words. Next, related, there are no neutral institutions, and this should be obvious to everyone at this stage, or certainly everybody in this room. And it also follows naturally from the conclusions of Schmitt. Next, the rule of law is a myth. Power is always decisionist. Schmitt's phrase, this is Schmitt's exception. See also the FBI raiding Donald Trump's home for a library fine or whatever the nominal reason they gave was, while refusing to investigate an entire laundry list of alleged elite crimes. You know, fill in your own blanks. Decisionism always triumphs over the theoretical rule of law. Now, this is not to say that law is unimportant, just that the rule of law, when applied to the sovereign, is a myth. There will always be someone who decides the exception. Next, power seeks to eliminate rival castles. This is, of course, from de Juvenel, and it explains at a stroke why we have practically no institutions on our side whatsoever. The regime has taken over or destroyed all of them. Finally, and some of you who were here last year will remember the topic, this was the topic of my talk last year, culture is downstream from law. What people call woke today is simply the enforcement of civil rights law. Or in the case of Britain, it is the enforcement of a whole raft of changes brought in by certain Tony Blair. And that's not going to be the first time I mention him. And I mean, I didn't wear a tie in recognition of the Dark Lord. No. But anyway, Christopher Caldwell has written excellently on this topic in his book, The Age of Entitlement, where he really lays out how the civil rights regime, in fact, I think Yarvin has talked about this in his kind of clear pill essay as well, I seem to recall. You know, it is really undergirded by law. And it's like, well, the culture catches up to what's already on the books. But you can also recall other cases, like, for example, does anybody remember Starbucks being sued because they had the temerity to call the police on two homeless black men who would not leave the store despite not buying a drink? I remember the legendary Frame Games Radio made excellent videos on this topic, long since banned or disappeared, but I'm sure you can still find them somewhere in the ether. But if the one thing you can take from that series that Frame Games Radio did, it was culture is downstream from law. The law was there first. Now, to these 7 basic ideas, I must foreground 2 other theses. First, and I've argued these elsewhere on my Substack in recent months. So first, against the hidden hand conspiracy frame. We do not need to invent mystical third parties to explain what's happening. I mean, we can see how power functions right in front of our eyes. And this is because power does not want to be hidden. It wants to display itself. The display of power is a source of power and control. Leftists of all stripes know this because they are made to read Michel Foucault at university. It's kind of remarkable. There is also the practical need to demonstrate hierarchy, and I'm going to give you an example of that shortly. Okay. My second kind of additional thesis here is against pure emergent phenomenon explanations. Okay. This is, in fact, a hidden form of the populist delusion. Bottom-up and anarchistic explanations of power, market, society, and so on are inherently liberal, but more importantly, wrong. But theoretically, okay, let's just hold this thought. Just pretend for a second that that was not the case, that theoretically you could have power that moves from the bottom up. It just so happens that this regime centrally coordinates and disciplines those who resist orders. If this was obscured in 2010, events over the past few years have made these things perfectly clear to everyone today in 2022. And I'll give you an example of that. So, first of all, let me give you an example of the first of these two theses I was talking about. Do you remember when Whoopi Goldberg was told off like a naughty schoolgirl and then shown mercy by the ADL president, Jonathan Greenblatt, in front of millions of people on ABC? Do you remember that? This was a classic Machiavellian display of power. Now, Machiavelli famously notes that it is better to be cruel than merciful as a rule, because then the people will remember the acts of mercy if cruelty is the norm. However, the prince should delegate all the acts of cruelty to some underling, while when mercy is to be shown, the prince should be front and center. You know, because now you think, well, the prince, you know, he's a good guy, he shows mercy. Whereas it's the nasty sheriff or whoever who's the cruel one. And this, I think, is why we were treated to old President Greenblatt here on television. But this display of power was doing more than simply disciplining Whoopi Goldberg. It was reminding everybody of the hierarchy. The fat, black, multimillionaire TV woman, she might have a lot of status in the system, but she's below the ADL, to whom she must beg and grovel for mercy. I mean, I'm not making this up, this happened. Millions of people watched it. So. And the ADL want you to see this, else it would not be on prime time television. And make no mistake, regardless of what television executives might want, if Jonathan Greenblatt wants to go on primetime television, he will go on primetime television. And as an example of the second, my two little theses here, we saw how the regime centrally coordinates recently when a diktat was released through the central messaging system, also known as the AP. That's the Associated Press. Has anyone here actually worked as a journalist or known any journalists for any amount of time? A few of you. I mean, I was married to a journalist for a while. 6 a.m. she'd get a story straight through from the AP. The editor would say, oh, here's your story, you go off and do it. Right? It's like, you know, all the stories come through from the Associated Press, the editor has a look, these are the 10 stories today. We won't bother with the man whose hat fell off and the dog who's been killed. We'll go with these 6 and off you go. Anyway, a couple of weeks back, or about 2 weeks ago, I think, the AP sent out this missive saying the meaning of the word recession has now changed. Now, I hate to be so tired, so trite and cliche to draw on George Orwell, but it is difficult not to think of the orders that Winston Smith would receive through those pipes in the Ministry of Truth. And what was interesting to watch in real time was how many journalists had already run with the story that we're in a recession, then publicly apologize and walk back what they had said. I mean, I guess that was an emergent phenomenon too. Now, with all of this said, there's some necessary complexity to note. First, there are emergent behaviors at the level of individuals in the non-governing elite, who, as the Marxist Louis Althusser might say, work by themselves. You know, most ideology just functions by itself. It doesn't need someone with a gun pointing at your head or whatever to work. So the people who are talking about emergent phenomena are kind of spotting that happening. But the tempo, the incentive structure, the law, all those things are set top down. Second, there are dialectical relationships in the system which serve to make hierarchy difficult to trace. I'm thinking about, I don't know, the CEO getting pushback from his woke graduate HR team or something. That's a bit of dialectical give and take in the system, I guess. However, most of the time, activists who appear to be resisting power are in fact agents of power being used to manufacture consent, i.e. being used to give the appearance of a popular mandate. If you disagree with this, by the way, you're saying that you believe that Greta Thunberg was in fact an organic phenomenon and that, you know, Black Lives Matter really was this bottom-up protest movement speaking truth to power. And if you believe that, you're probably at the wrong event. Now, before I talk you through the Octopus, I also want to make some general observations about the regime which will complicate the picture further. It is worth asking the most fundamental question of all. Who are the ruling class? Who are the elites? Who exactly are we up against? Now, if you ask 10 different dissidents this question, they'll probably give you 10 different answers. And here is my answer to that question. And some of you will have seen this before, but it's worth going through again, I think. There are, I believe, 3 competing factions within the ruling class. Broadly, we can call these the neocons, embodied in the American military-industrial complex, the techno-globalists in the middle column there, as symbolized by the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab in his evil Bond gear, you know. And finally, you have the third worldists, as embodied by George Soros and his Open Society Foundation. Now, I think it is worth talking through their competing aims, their goals, and their methods of operation. Just to flesh this out a little bit. The ultimate aim of the neocons is to remake the world in America's image. In other words, to subordinate every tradition and culture under the lesbian stiletto heel of liberal democracy so that everybody can enjoy unlimited anal sex and a never-ending cavalcade of black people on television. Meanwhile, the techno-globalists are much more practically focused. They're focused on things like energy and food and technology, buying up housing stock and charging it back to you for rent, things like that. And their ultimate aim is to establish a global governance structure or even a formal government at that global level, you know, which will have a president, you know, brackets Tony Blair, etc. And he's still annoyed he didn't get that European president job, you know. Anyway, and finally, the third worldists, and this will be a bit controversial. So the third worldists simply want to equalize the relative standings of the West and the third world. You know, they think that, you know, we've had it good for too long in the West. We need to bring up the other parts of the world. You know, if you actually read George Soros's interminable books, this is what they're all about, ultimately. And in my view, the real struggle is between the neocons and the techno-globalists, while the third worldists, in that third column there, and George Soros and everything that those guys do, in my view, represent a distraction for the left and the right to squabble over. I don't, this will be controversial, but I don't believe that those guys functionally have power in the system. I really don't. I mean, they'll affect certain things. They'll, you know, help shift refugees into Britain and things like that, and, you know, hand out leaflets to tell a Syrian guy how to navigate the borders and get into Germany. This is the sort of thing Soros does. But I don't actually think that that faction is you know, I just feel that they're off to one side. And I know a lot of people disagree with me on that. Now, very generally, the response to COVID saw the techno-globalists grow their power, while the war between Russia and Ukraine has seen neocons claw back a lot of power. Now, of course, there are many elites, for example, the Dark Lord, Tony Blair, who have a foot firmly in both camps. Well, I mean, what does that mean? I mean, it means that, like, that Foreign Affairs Council that they all go to in Washington, like Blair's there, and as well as the, you know, as well as hanging out with Larry Fink and Bill Gates and all of that stuff, which we'll get to in a moment. But eventually, so, okay, at the moment you have people who are in both of these camps, okay, but remember the rules of power here. Eventually, the techno-globalists will have to come to see the neocons as a rival castle. Because neocons seek to maintain American and Israeli hegemony, while the techno-globalists are more genuinely universalist. And on those sorts of scores, where the techno-globalists are kind of find themselves at all with the American power, you'll see them make this strategic alliance with the Soros strand, because Soros is kind of against the American industrial complex side of things as well, if you really understand what he's saying. Where were we? Neocons use the instruments of American power, while globalists use the instruments of transnational power, such as the UN, the WHO, do you remember them? Climate change protocols, and so on. Basically, all these things are designed to constrain national sovereignty. They're an attack on, but they also constrain American power too. The neocon power base is what you might call the Washington swamp. This is backed generally by organized Jewish groups, wonk think tanks. There's a whole kind of seething world of guys who just do nothing but live policy in Washington. Sure Curtis has met these people. While the techno-globalist power base is corporate-backed, generally by a nebulous cluster of NGOs, non-government organizations. Neocons typically exercise power through the state, while the techno-globalists typically exercise it through corporate compliance culture. Now, I mention this because while we might point to general tendencies in the regime hierarchy, which I'm about to do, we must recognize that these rival factions operate differently. i.e., I'm really focusing on this central strand here with the octopus, but you have to remember in neocon world, it'll be slightly different from some of the arrows and things may work slightly differently in their power structure, okay? Now, a general observation is that once you recognize these basic factions, and then there'll be people who think they're all on the same side ultimately, but let's just pretend for a second that these three factions are real. It informs you, once you understand what they're trying to do, what is and is not containment from the absolute point of view of power, which only cares about maintaining itself. It informs what is and is not allowed within the regime discourse. Now, some of you may remember this admittedly tongue-in-cheek, it was kind of tongue-in-cheek table I made outlining what is and is not allowable dissent. Now, while this may seem shocking to everybody here, anti-trans, anti-CRT, and anti-abortion are not particularly edgy stances, and they come with financial and professional rewards within the regime. As you slide down this scale, you see the topics that are total no-go zones within the regime. Now, we need not dwell on what they are. You all know what they are anyway. Other than to point out that this scale is an indication of what the regime holds truly sacred and what it feels it can and cannot contain. And I've written elsewhere about what containment means when it comes to power before. Okay, now with all of that said, let us finally get to the octopus. And I'll go back so you can look at it. Here it is. As you can see, it has 8 tentacles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's right, yeah. Okay. But these tentacles aren't like equal, because in my view, what I've called the chest here is the beating heart. The financial system, and especially the central banks, the investment banks, and the massive asset management firms such as BlackRock and Vanguard, which between them manage almost $20 trillion. Now, old-fashioned dissidents would call this the money power, okay? Now, the relationship between a firm like BlackRock and the US Treasury, nominally in charge of the Fed, is basically formalized at this point. In 2016, Larry Fink, pictured here, there's Larry Fink, if you've never seen him before, donated something like $22 million to the Clinton campaign and had a team of former BlackRock staffers ready to move in to work directly for the US Treasury. When Trump won, it almost made no difference whatsoever, because it was widely reported that the US Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, was in daily contact with Larry Fink, who, through the ETF market, which are now on the federal asset balance sheet, contracted to BlackRock, controls a large part of the US economy. Okay? I mean, just that power alone. Power to say, well, what is the Fed going to invest in? That's up to BlackRock now, or a large part of it is. When Biden later did get into power, he installed Janet Yellen, there she is, who has an even closer relationship with Fink than Mnuchin did. And she's now the new US Treasury Secretary, and we're living through her wonderful, amazing policy decisions every single day. Now, BlackRock and Vanguard are an interesting case study in James Burnham's managerial thesis in action, I think. First, do I have a picture of them there? Anyway, BlackRock and Vanguard have no declared owners. They are simply owned by the millions of people who have their assets managed by them. Probably there are people in this room who have pensions being managed by BlackRock and don't even know it, I'd imagine. Now, if you know your Burnham, this means that the disorganized mass of shareholders is ruled over by the organized managerial elites as embodied in Larry Fink, who manages those assets. In fact, they're literally called passive management funds. Thus, we see the severance of ownership and control. However, note at the same time that BlackRock and Vanguard are listed as 4 to 8% minority shareholders in just about every major multinational organization. And just to, I hate to dwell on this, but it really is something when you start looking through this list. Number 1 or number 2 shareholder, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet. I mean, just those 4 alone is just incredible. But Johnson & Johnson, I mean, what did they get up to recently? ExxonMobil, anyone remember like the 2000s? Do you remember them? Visa, MasterCard. Well, there's the entire global kind of credit transactions. You know, they facilitate basically every action. You know, when you are now in the new cashless society, every time you tap that card, it's being facilitated by one of these two companies. Procter & Gamble, huge company. I tried to boycott Procter & Gamble. I found it impossible. I did quite well for a while, but then my daughter was born and I was like, shit, nappies, Pampers, they're Procter & Gamble. But I was like, okay, well, let's look at the next brand, some other nappies. Oh, they're also made by Procter & Gamble. That's, you know, the whole, and then what's your choice? Like the other baby products are made by Johnson & Johnson and the other ones are made by Unilever. I mean, it's like, okay, there's a brilliant, thanks market. Coca-Cola, Pepsi. I mean, it's just funny that they're just like right next to each other like that. Thanks for my choice, you know. Verizon, Cisco Systems, McDonald's, Intel, Walmart, Walt Disney. I mean, like AT&T. That's like a huge swathe of infocom infrastructure in America, right? Is owned by AT&T. Nike of the Black Lives Matter looting fame or whatever. So anyway, I mean, I don't want to labor the point, but it's really important because such is their enormous power that BlackRock and Vanguard can essentially crash the price of any publicly listed company. BlackRock is not simply the largest institutional investor in the world, but through its Aladdin software, and it is called Aladdin, you can find like fun like genie memes and things of this. It essentially controls the general flow of the index itself, by which I mean the S&P 500. Aladdin is not a neutral platform. It makes suggestions on what to invest in and what not to. Kind of, I mean, a lot of them are passive. It just does it by, it's just automated. But even if you, like, let's say you just wanted to do it yourself, it'd be like, okay, I fancy investing in this one, and be like, oh, did you know this company is not like, doesn't conform to ESG principles or whatever it is. It kind of gives you nudges to invest this way or invest that way. And naturally, these ESG principles and climate stuff is part of its algorithm. Thus, BlackRock have functional leverage over, for example, a corporation like Microsoft, listed number 2 there. Therefore, it really, oh, there's a pic, that's what Aladdin looks like apparently when you go in. So it really behooves someone like Bill Gates, for example, or frankly anybody who is running Microsoft, because I believe Gates is no longer involved in the day-to-day operations, to share the same values as these crucial institutional investors. I mean, otherwise you'd say, well, it's a coincidence. All of these CEOs like think the same thing as Larry Fink. When Larry Fink sends his quarterly letter to the CEOs, which I now, that's my number one thing. I've set like a little alert. When does Larry Fink send out this letter? It's worth reading it because it really is quite something. It's practically like a set of orders from a Soviet commissar. You know, you don't want to get left, like he'll dress it up in certain language, but basically you don't want to get left behind on this. You know, there'll be consequences type thing. If you're not net zero, we're gonna, you know, your company's history basically. Thus, the compliance culture of corporations is downstream of the institutional pressure that these massive asset management firms like BlackRock can push on them. This is not coming from Harvard graduates who are simply a product of this power structure. It is coming from the top. The corporations, thus disciplined, can funnel their vast resources into this thing, the network, various foundations who fund NGO groups. And you all know my favorite example of an NGO. Let me see if I can find it. Where is my favorite example of an NGO? Oh yes, Bill Gates has been the principal financial backer of, anyone guess who? who's come in. Bill Gates has been the principal financial backer of Tony Blair, one of the world's most powerful men, since practically the second he left 10 Downing Street in 2007. You can actually track this because the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you can actually just type in where they sent their money. You just type in Blair and it's like Blair leaves Downing Street, payment 1. It's like the next day, you know, he's up and running. He's already got his network together. The Tony Blair Institute is the model of the modern NGO. And it makes Blair far more powerful than whoever the current Prime Minister happens to be. Not that it matters, since they're all versions of Tony Blair in any case. In the recent, the 3 front runners in the recent Toryship leadership race, do you remember Penny Mordaunt? She wrote a book explicitly praised by Blair. Rishi Sunak was dubbed by the media the heir to Blair, while Tony Blair himself has explicitly allied with the likely leader, Liz Truss, who quoted him at the start of a recent campaign speech. Can you imagine being a Conservative in that? Oh, you know, stepping up, and the first person that Truss quotes is Blair. It's like, did I join the right, you know? They probably all cheered, let's be honest. Okay, so anyway, this alliance between the chest and the network, in my view, sits above what I call the crown, which is to say the official government of whatever outpost of the global empire you happen to be sitting in. We all know that democracy is a terrible system. Politicians have a very short-term planning horizon. Their eye is always on polls, the current news cycle, but what this means in terms of actually governing, actually running things, is that they're extremely lazy. Now, you may know an MP and be like, oh, what do you mean they're lazy? They're always working, but they're always working on, like, they're not working on policy. They're working on, like, putting out media fires or whatever else they're up to. So when it comes to policy, they essentially outsource it to this network of NGOs. In pure elite theory terms, the NGOs are organized while the government is disorganized. The government needs a policy, for example, on the pandemic, which we saw recently, or on climate change, or on whatever else. And it just so happens that the Tony Blair Institute has a 200-page policy ready to go, rubber stamped, and so the NGO policy proposal becomes official government policy. And I'm sure many nerds in this room have got used to looking at these things now. I mean, they're so lazy, they just don't change. You can literally just have whole paragraphs and sentences, word for word, lifted from the NGO white paper into the government policy. The MPs probably didn't even read it, to be honest. Now, in this way, what is already decided by the, by the network, by the people who fund them, is then handed through the crown to what I've called the bench here, which is the kind of judiciary and the law enforcement, and to the chamber, which is the permanent civil service. And they hand these things down to enact and to enforce. And remember, culture is downstream from law. Okay? Law does not apply to the sovereign, to the exception, but it applies to all of us plebs, and it applies to all of the underlings. So law matters, but it just doesn't matter for who, for who's sitting at the top. Which means that the media and its manufacturing of consent only get the memo after this process has already taken place. Once the nudge unit, which I guess the nudge unit is in some obscure office there. Once the nudge unit sets to work, then you'll see the media outlets walk in almost lockstep compliance with whatever has already been decided. In fact, interestingly, the media will often cover these things as if they have not already been decided. They'll write as if it's still a live conversation, but in fact, the conversation's over, the decision's already taken, we're just being told about it now. As a case in point, This really sinister paper, published in October 2019, prefigures the current push for plant-based burgers and Beyond Meat by almost 3 years. The media articles championing these things not only post-date this article, but also they are part of the explicit campaign it outlines. There's literally a page in this document saying, oh, there needs to be a media campaign pushing like plant-based burgers to get the public to accept them because, you know, we know that they don't want them. This hasn't come from Harvard or Yale. It was BlackRock defined ESG investment strategy and World Economic Forum policy before it was a policy proposal from an NGO, before it became official government policy, before it became a media headline. Now, if you're not paying close enough attention, it looks like the media simply memed this trend into existence. But in fact, the media are just acting as the mouthpiece for decisions that have already been taken. Now, who wrote this paper? There's a man called Dr. Richard Carmichael. He is a professor at Imperial College London, but he works typically on climate change projects that are funded by grant money. Who funds him? Well, his two main sources of revenue are the UK government and something called the Grantham Foundation, which was set up, there's Grantham there, it was set up in 1997 by the billionaire investor Jeremy Grantham, who is something of a prototype Larry Fink, actually. He was a trailblazer in the 70s before BlackRock. Note how this is not just a bunch of stuff being organically produced by crazy left-wing professors. It is actively incentivized. Themes for research are set top-down. I mean, literally, the government sticks out a call, oh, I want you to research stuff on this theme. If you research stuff on this theme, we'll give you millions of pounds. And anybody who's had any experience working in academia, certainly in this country, knows that is how it works. In America, as always, it's slightly more privatized, but that's where old Grantham comes in and similar cases. Academics are simply the paid shills of the regime, used to generate arguments to justify what has already been decided. And this is obvious because they've already decided the theme. They've already sent out the call. And he has literally just produced the report that did what the government wanted. Thus, if we had to plot, so you can see here, that paper would have been produced somewhere in there and then it's passed down, media press releases. I mean, journalists are lazy too. You know, the AP thing will come through, oh, here's a press release. This dude has written a report on Beyond Meat or whatever it is. The editor will get it and they'll be like, oh, you know, go out, here's your story today, and there it is. That's how, on any given news day, you'll see the same story just reproduced hundreds of times by every minor paper around the world. It's just the same. It's the same press release. Anyway, where were we? So yeah, here's the rough flow of power through the system. If you want to follow those arrows, it's a bit clearer than the very first one. Now, just in passing, the church, which I'm not going to talk about much there, the church will be of interest to Christians, I suppose. This represents simply the captured rival castles of enemies of the regime. The church is disciplined by law, and it is forced to become the skin suit for the ruling class and its ideology, subordinating Christ to George Floyd, the pride flag, whatever the current thing happens to be, Ukraine, Zelensky, whatever the standing Christ is for the day. Anyway, long-time readers of Yarvin, and indeed Yarvin himself, surely cannot help but notice that what he called the cathedral roughly speaking, the head and the mouth here that I've circled, are fairly low down in this pecking order. Whereas in Yarvin's system, and here are some graphics to remind you of, I mean, I don't know if, I don't think Curtis made these himself, but this is a kind of memes to help understand what the cathedral model was. In here, I mean, he called them the brain and the voice. Now, if you notice, the cathedral's somewhere near the top in his system. The vestiges of corporate power are said only to be leaks. Now, he is correct that the show, which is this, if you have a look down at this right-hand column, the show is basically the everyday news, the politics of Tory versus Labour or GOP versus Democrat. Is merely an illusion. It's a TV show. Liberal democracy's method of obscuring the actual mechanisms of power and to generate scapegoats for it so that those who really wield it never face accountability. You know, just off the top of my head, like Grenfell. Oh, that was the evil Tories. I mean, it wasn't like the management company who was contracted to do it and all the many middle managers who were part of that process. You know, you can just generally, you know, boo at the establishment heels, you know, the kayfabe heels. But I think, so he's right about that. And he is also correct, of course, that for the day-to-day running of most things, the media, like, you know, he talks about it being a media-run regime. The media is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. But ultimately, I think they are rule takers rather than rule makers. I don't think we can ignore the lines of funding and the extent to which the chest uses the network to exert power and influence. I'm sure you've seen this graph before, but I think it does neatly demonstrate the point. This was the increase in focus on race and racism in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And do you remember the Occupy Wall Street movement? It's funny that, isn't it? The left is not in control. It has been utterly humiliated and tamed by the regime. Where the left once represented a threat to capital, as Marx might put it, now the left literally cheers on multinational corporations and sticks up for the Walt Disney Company in the name of the right to sexualize children. They have been totally and utterly contained. The brief, and you know, it's this, you know. The brief resurgence of old Labour under Corbyn was buried and destroyed by accusations of anti-Semitism. And in that case, that was close to Blair and Campbell's heart. That was like I remember the stream we did, it was hilarious, but do you remember the internal memos from Labour just destroying Corbyn from the inside? Corbyn was promptly replaced by yet another Blair cipher, Keir Starmer. The cathedral has a habit of jumping to the tune of the neoliberal centre, which just so happens to align explicitly with the interests of the chest. Now, this map I've made is simply a starting point for thinking seriously about the totality of the problem. In my view, the real issue here is that focusing on any of these 6 tentacles below the chest and the network is a bit like focusing on summoned minions being conjured by an end boss. You know, imagine you're playing a video game, you know, oh, we're just killing the skeletons. Oh, there's another skeleton. I mean, it's futile. You have to, you know, I grew up playing Contra 3. You have to go over the heart. Okay. Where was I? Okay. Now it could be done. It could be done if people on our side of things captured some of these other tentacles. you could do damage. For example, using the power of the crown, you might create viable state-backed alternatives to Visa and MasterCard, or even alternatives to investment banks, or even alternatives to asset management firms to break their monopoly. You could create, I think this was literally a Jeremy Corbyn idea actually, a national bank which guarantees that you, as a British citizen, can have an account. And this would help to combat people being treated like Alex Jones or Laura Towler or any number of other people who have simply been cut off from their bank accounts as a form of financial deplatforming. I mean, at the very least, that decision should be one taken by the British government, not by Visa or MasterCard or, you know, Larry Fink or anyone else. The situation in Russia is one to look at in terms of the potential for a national government to set up alternatives to the power structure of the chest, especially in the area of daily transactions. Remember, Russia was taken off SWIFT, and it has forced that part of the world, and Russia in particular, to now have to, well, someone has to facilitate those transactions. It's not going to be Visa or MasterCard anymore. I mean, you know. And in fact, in the past couple of days, I've noticed that several US states, like Texas, has now started to target BlackRock. It has literally banned BlackRock being involved in anything to do with kind of Texas state investments. Now, like being the Republicans, they've given like the shittest reason in the world, which is, you know, oil stocks or something like. But still, it's a start. Okay, I am not intending to blackpill anyone, but really try to clarify what needs to be done. To quote another dissident in the past. Now, however, it wouldn't be right to end on this kind of uplifting note. So, if I had to make a prediction, I still think at some point the regime must put the woke genie back in the bottle in order to cement its control and to contain genuine dissident energy. When that happens, the threat from populists will be dissipated overnight, and people can go back to, well, what I call back to Fresh Prince, without being reminded that they're racists every day. White boys can then sign up once again to die in their wars. And I expect when this moment happens, when like sense finally prevails, I expect that to be the final victory of the regime over what is called the dissident right. And I continue to be shocked every day that they are being so slow about it, but there are a lot of signs that it's happening. You know, Dark Lord gave Starmer the order 4 months ago. Drop woke. Direct order in The Guardian. Biden is too woke, even for Democrat voters. Larry Fink denies that he's woke. I mean, what I'm saying is, if you think about social desirability, why is Larry Fink denying that he's woke? He's obviously like a toxic brand or something. And you can see it happening. Like, there's DeSantis in Florida, who's doing like very visible things now. Again, I think it's containment. I've laid out why I think it is. But in the minds of most people, something's being done about this. It's a victory. If you pay enough attention, it's even being done here through Liz Truss. I mean, if you read the left-wing media, Liz Truss is putting together the most far-right government this country's ever seen. Why? I mean, yay! But it's interesting though, because if you read their actual statements, they're at least paying lip service to doing something about this. And when this happens, I fully expect to see interest and energy in dissident politics evaporate almost overnight, and it'll really be then when we discover who the vanguard are, friends. So, and that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
To what extent do you think the octopus still has its tentacles around the other power bases in, say, India, Brazil. What you're talking about is very Western-centered. So just interested how you think that things are playing out internationally.
First of all, I have to say I like a kind of white Flavor Flav with a kind of a. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and it does seem like Modi's government in India has come out of the slip of the octopus. Brazil, certainly, Russia. I mean, we are heading into this multipolar world, but like we have to think like, okay, that's great if you're Indian or something, but for us, you know, it may actually mean in the short term things get worse because it actually strengthens them because then they can use that. What's that line from Henry IV? I like to quote Biddy, giddy, busy. I always forget it. Exactly, that's it. Yes, and I think that's been the ace card so many times. You know, Falklands War, Iraq. You know, and this is something else. Like I keep on saying that they're going to pull this containment move, and I think people forget about how extreme things got back in the late 60s. Nixon, you know, or even in the late 70s, before Ronald Reagan came in on a wave of populism before neocons gutted the Republican Party yet again. But the actual sentiments, what you ran on, was a kind of return to conservatism. And, you know, think of how hysterical the left were in the 80s. They thought, what's that stupid novel that was, you know, the Handmaid's Tale? Oh, I've marked so many terrible Handmaid's Tale essays. I tell you. But yeah, you know, that was that's what they thought was happening in the country from the left-wing point of view. So they've done it before. And of course, Bush. You know, the thing to look out for whenever the regime is giving you permission to be racist, you know, that's kind of when they're pulling these, you know, boo Arabs or whatever. You know, that tends to be when they're trying to get you back on side. Yeah. Anyone else?
Okay. I'd like to congratulate you on. Hello.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. You also look like a white Flavor Flav with a. Yeah, yeah.
A strict top-down conception of power to a more factional or node-based theory of power. So it's moving closer towards a truer conception of power as a explained by network theory. So that's really like that. One question about the valuation of BlackRock. Did you said was 20 trillion?
That was the combined BlackRock and Vanguard. Well, you've got to also forget the number 3 firm in the world is State Street. Who did that?
We could argue about 10, but what's 10 or 20 trillion between friends.
Yeah.
The important thing is to see
what
is that as a percentage of the total wealth. Coming from the science discipline, we want to know when somebody gives us a figure, we want to know what that is as a total of the total wealth. And I've seen figures from McKinsey of 400 trillion. Sorry, no, McKinsey, this figure is 1,540 trillion, up from 400 trillion in 2000. So that 20 trillion represents about 2% of the total value of all the assets, real assets, cash, property, and I presume that includes on-mined resources. So is 2%, okay, you might add in State Street another 2%. Is the chest really that significant?
It's a big percentage of the liquid capital though. So like if you want to move the stock.
Well, I mean, I would just say like that. Let's even in the area of finance, don't slip back into populist delusion. It's not just they're a 2%; they're an organised 2%, and they're a 2%. I mean, there's something else that I maybe didn't make clear, which is that such is the size of their position within the market. If you can imagine you're an investor, even if you hated BlackRock, right? If BlackRock makes a move, all the rest of the investors have to take notice one way or the other. So they set it's like, I tried to explain this before, like guys like Warren Buffett say, they were always saying, well, whatever the market does, I go the other way, you short the stock, all that sort of stuff. BlackRock and Vanguard don't do that. They're kind of like, they are the index in a way. They are the market. They just set the general tempo. Right, so it's like, well, you know, it's a very significant, that 2% is very significant because it also has huge knock-on effects. I mean, if we could find a way to sever the influence of those values on some of these, because I mean, I don't really believe that every corporation in the world desperately wants this stuff. They must know it's not always good for their bottom line. You know, lots of these things aren't like they're meant to be run for profit, these things, and lots of these things, you know, are toxic for their brand, but they're kind of caught in this place where they kind of have to go along with these things. And I think if there was a mechanism to make, I don't know what that would be, that's something to think about. If there was some way to create an alternative in the market which wouldn't destroy all those companies I listed, some of them might go for it, you know, they might, but at the moment, they're almost just like that scared teacher in the diversity training who's not willing to speak out, right? Okay, yeah.
Hello. You said earlier that despite his economic power and actions like giving Syrians free advice on how to cross the border, that George Soros isn't as powerful as we all might think.
Yes.
Would you be able to provide some insight on that point? Just maybe how to pinpoint true power from what you were describing?
Yeah, well, what George Soros wants has a habit of not happening. Whereas what powerful people want has a habit of actually happening. So what I did is I went and I found a book of his published in 2001 or 2002 called The Bubble of American Supremacy. I was like, what's this doing here? And I picked it out and it burnt acid through my hands and stuff. But then I actually like read it and I was like, this is just like a kind of shit lib analysis of George Bush's Iraq. You know, I mean, he's just like kind of Michael Moore or something, with lots of money. But still, it's like, well, you know, I'm not seeing. I think he's a very convenient. In fact, one thing I didn't say is that I also think that the Schwab is a very visible boogeyman and he's not like Schwab could die tomorrow, and I mean, I hope he doesn't, of course, but you understand what I'm saying, right? I just don't think that he is necessarily as significant as, you know, he's a very convenient kind of boomer villain, I think, you know, so, yeah.
So you say that these goals of a man like Soros, the third worldization, right? They're, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding, you say they're not happening or they're not being achieved, they're sort of a pipe dream. But I mean, you know, how do you then explain the past 10 years, the millions of North Africans, you know, coming into Europe? How do you explain what's happening to places like lovely Birmingham? I mean, surely that is happening.
Yeah, well, if I mean, to be serious for a second, if George Soros was getting what he wanted, they wouldn't even need to come here because, you know, Africa would be this wonderful, like, you know, Africa itself would have come up and capital would have been redirected there, and, you know, the historical gap between the West and the rest of the world would have shrunk and so on. But I don't really see any of that, you know, stuff happen. I mean, they did do a few things. I remember when I was a teenager, there was a lot of talk about like debts being forgiven to third world countries. Like Soros was big on that. Did that happen? Maybe it did happen to some extent.
It happens every week.
You know, no, you don't owe us. Yeah.
Well, where would you say exactly this impulse is coming from then? If Soros's goal is to equalize wealth, I mean, where is the impulse for the mass immigration coming from? Who's responsible?
Oh, he's up for that. Don't forget. Like, but BlackRock are massively up for that too, because it and he not this is no secret. He literally talks about it every week in Bloomberg or whatever, like in his stated interviews, in his talks at the World Economic, like this is open information. They want immigration to stop wages rising. Like literally, they say this because it's bad for the economy if wages rise at a time of inflation. They say it every week.
How universal would you say that this Octopus structure is, and how specific is it to the current system that we have?
I actually think it's extremely specific to our current system, and it is, as far as I can tell, something the likes of which the world has not seen before. Probably the closest analog would be something like the East India Company. But remember, the East India Company was just literally nationalized by the UK government in the end. So that rival castle was shut down by the government. Whereas let's just pretend that the US government wanted to nationalize any one of the, not just BlackRock, like let's just say the US government wanted to nationalize Google. Do you think they could do it? Who knows? I think Morgoth had a video about that. It's like, well, what would happen? Because theoretically, like Google could buy an army, and that'd be fun. It'd be amazingly fun to watch play out. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to add maybe some more context in terms of George Soros, going back to that point, because, I mean, you say that he doesn't get his way, but if you look at, say, the website of the Open Society Foundation, you can see that he has multiple other goals other than third worldism, say like drug legalization, for example. Which is, it seems to go through almost de facto in every industrialized country. So I think that's a pretty big W for him, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Or you could look at certain human rights things, like the state of places like San Francisco currently. I think that's also very much a W in the book of the Open Society Foundation. I don't know if you agree or not.
Yeah. No, I mean, I shouldn't say he navigates. I shouldn't say he does influence the system. Just in my view, he is not of the size to be a genuine rival faction to the neocons, as I believe the techno globalists are. Another area Soros has had a lot of wins, by the way, is in the US, like getting in attorneys at the US state level and things like that. I mean, there are tons of guys he's backed within that system. So, yeah.
You did a wonderful job of explaining some of the differences between what you think and what Curtis Yarvin thinks, and I wanted to try and draw out some of those differences, ideally to the point of causing some physical violence between the two of you. I'll be taking bets. Yeah. So, as I understand it, you're saying that two particular parts of the network and the chess sit at the top, and that's the difference. So it might just be that this question is answered with a yes, but I'm just trying to kind of get clear on this. Does it follow from that you think that if you could sort of control the minds of the key figures within the chest and the network, but no one else, that you could, without replacing anyone in academia, without replacing anyone in the judiciary, without replacing anyone in any other part of the system, that just by controlling those, you could thereby bring about the new wonderful based world? And I'm hoping
that's a really good question. I mean, that would change a huge amount of things. Like I said, there's complexity in there. For a start, these two different factions that I've talked about can both use the media as a tool. And in fact, it's even beyond that. There's a red media and a blue media too, in this country and in America. So different people can use the media for different things on different days. So it's not quite as straightforward as that. But one of the huge things that would change is the sorts of things that people fund. Let's just take one issue. That book I've got, The Transgender Industrial Complex, which was banned on Amazon and elsewhere, which literally all that book does is list the funding, who funded them, and the names of the people involved. They don't like it when you start listing names. That's why they banned it. Well, if all that money was gone, or if it was being directed towards, I don't know, you know, the sort of thing that we were talking about, a new national mythos for Britain. Now you get $3 million for doing that rather than the climate change stuff. All of those academics, if they want like successful career, would have to redirect their work. Now, it would take time because lots of them would be true believers. So it wouldn't happen overnight. But then again, the system now didn't happen overnight. It took them 40, 50 years to get to the point where they are now. So,
this is the last question. Looking at your diagram there, that was there.
Do you want to go back
Maybe I was too distracted by the big blue arrows going from the chest to the network to the crown, but
yeah.
I was wondering, maybe do the populists have it right that if you capture the crown, you break the chain? Where if you have you said a disorganized crown at the moment, but an organized crown, and it said no to the network, it said no to the chest, and it has access to what Yarvin calls the castle.
Yeah, interestingly missing is like the military. I just didn't, there's so much of a non-factor, I didn't even list them. But I mean, it's true. If you have control over the military, you can get a hell of a lot done, yeah. No, yeah, I think that's right. There would then be a genuine question as to this scenario that we were talking about over here. Like, I'll give you an example, right? Back in Henry Ford's day, FDR wanted to nationalize Ford Motor Company, and FDR wielded power like a prince, like a Machiavellian prince. What he said was sovereign, and there was back then the U.S. state was strong enough where it would genuinely be a question. Well, maybe they will nationalize Ford. Whereas now, I think that the octopus is so big, and Juvenal talks about this as well, where it's like these rival castles, if you want, the corporations, have now grown to such a size where they almost sit like above the US government. So I think that were that to happen, we're like, let's just pretend that everything they say about Trump is true and he's like Hitler 2.0 or something, okay? And they actually did start to be like, right, we're going to nationalize Facebook and Google and Twitter, and BlackRock is banned, and we're going to string up Larry Fink. I actually wonder whether there's enough power in the US state to be able to achieve that now, or whether they'd go to war. And they might even use like the governments of the countries they still control to go war, to challenge the rogue. And this is actually a very interesting part of the way the empire works, by the way, because they signal allegiance to the regime by being more regime than the head of it, which is America. So like Canada is more gay, always. Britain, like they may be up for anal sex over there, but in Britain, like that's all we do 24/7, We have police who dance to the pride flag, whereas, you'd probably still be beaten up if you tried to do that in some place in America.
We may be asked to go to America to restore its democracy.
Exactly. That they paint that regime as a rogue regime, and use the rest of their power. And I honestly think that it depends how crazed they are, but that could be a significant wartime scenario. Or maybe the American army is powerful enough that everybody would just go like, okay. In which case, great, we've won. I doubt it.